So, honestly, before we start talking about Dragon Age the VeilGuard, quick thing, this is the 9th iteration of the script I wrote for this video, and through that, I've realized a glaring problem with my process here. For one, while I like the pros and cons format, leaving them open-ended to essentially cover anything I want is a bad idea. Every video seems to have a different set of parameters, and that makes my scoring vary wildly game to game. In BioShock, for instance, the story was weighted way heavier against the final score, while in Doom Eternal, I think I only took... Wait, honestly, I don't even know if I took any points from it now that I'm looking back through my notes. May need to redo those at some point down the line. Anyway, instead, here are the categories I'll be basing the overall score of every game going forward and their associated point values. We're going with story at 20, gameplay at 50, variety at 10, and replayability at 20. It's still gonna go off a 100-point total system, as well as I am going to leave in the aspect of hours of enjoyment versus price, but the overall grade of the game will be separate, and the price per hour will be solely based off my experience, since, well, I don't know, saying I enjoyed Doom Eternal for 120 plus hours, but only giving it a 62 felt off, to say the least. And Dragon Age the VeilGuard solidified that feeling for me, so let's talk about it. So, first and foremost, the story of the VeilGuard feels weird. Yeah, there's no real other way for me to put that. I'm a little lost on how I even want to word this because I am genuinely confused about a host of decisions that went on here, but here goes. In VeilGuard, there seems to be a roller coaster of urgency and lack thereof in order to push the story forward. While Elganon and Gillenane, the two gods threatening the destruction of the world, are by far the main threat of the overall story, it seems to only be a real urgent matter when it's time for the story to progress. Other than that, it's almost an afterthought. Every serious moment or objective that you've completed is quickly undercut by some lighthearted banter, a trip back to the lighthouse to recap and do a quick vibe check, or to give a "so long as we have each other" pep talk. Then quickly, after those moments, we are dumped back into the story because the gods found a MacGuffin, or they blighted a town, or the dragons are attacking. I suppose in terms of the writing, they were trying to instill the feeling that the gods are one step ahead of you at all times, but to me, it didn't feel that way. In truth, it felt like they were ahead of us because we, the team of heroes, seem to be wasting a lot of time dealing with unrelated issues to the world-ending plot, which immediately brings us to the companion quest for the team. And just off the bat, if nothing else, this game is a great lesson in story stakes. The companion quests, for the most part, aside from a few scarce moments, are completely disconnected from the main objective. A few tie in, mostly in terms of cities or characters directly affected by the gods, but other than that, they are entirely their own set of separate problems for each individual companion. I guess this technically is going to relate more to gameplay, but to make it so much worse and so much more disconnecting from the main story, the companion quests are boring, just mind-numbingly boring. You're either fighting the same enemies aside from a few villain of the week bosses, or doing these sad excuse for puzzles while having a long conversation relevant only to that companion. It just rips you straight out of the game. The problem here, and the lesson we can take away from it, is that when the stakes are so high that the literal world is on the line, the individual self-contained problems of your friends don't really matter. Look, if they win and succeed in destroying the world, all of your personal struggles, curiosities, and journeys no longer matter or exist. It's over. You lost. I found myself increasingly more frustrated the longer the game insisted or reminded me that, hey, the world is ending, but don't forget about your companions. They have a lot they need to focus on as well, and they may be distracted when it comes to the final battle. No, that's not just me saying that. Take a look.
I think we've all been distracted.
I've been preoccupied myself after discovering that hand of glory.
And I can't stop worrying about my new magic and what it means.
The Nodists are fallen? What it means for my people?
Until those problems are resolved, we will not be prepared to face the gods.
So, yeah, world ending is bad, but they have bigger problems, apparently. How? I don't know, but doing each companion quest matters, and we will fucking get to how much it matters in a second. And I don't know, with all this focusing on companions and a roller coaster degree of urgency, the tone feels light, and that's weird, to say the least. The world is at risk of destruction, which you would think would cause some tension or stressful outbursts between companions when mistakes are made, but from what I could tell, no one in the game was really allowed to disagree or clash with each other in any meaningful way. The closest I got was Lucanus and Darwin, and truthfully, that was barely even a conflict. On top of that, it was over and resolved about 6 lines of dialogue later. Speaking of the dialogue quickly, something that irked me throughout the entire playthrough was how your character Rook spoke to the group or even NPCs you encounter. I never felt like I was speaking to experienced adventurers or hardened warrior leaders. I honestly felt like I was speaking how I would imagine you talk to a bunch of overzealous, inexperienced teenagers. I'm never telling an out-of-line adult to shut the fuck up. I'm scolding a misbehaving child in a way to teach them how to properly behave. What is happening? I'd like to get away from the tone, but honestly, this is probably gonna add to it, and it's Elganon and Gillenane being the most forgettable, benign villains. I mean, seriously, Tentacle Chick and budget short-stack Thanos couldn't be more cookie cutter. They're evil because, well, they're evil, and that's kind of all I got from them, and it doesn't make for an interesting story. You see Solus in the early game, and I really thought they were setting up a deep, interesting, complex antagonist for the story, but then, and I mean this literally, Evil 1 and Evil 2 just pop out of nowhere. Come on, you literally had a better choice than that. Oh, right, and speaking of choice when it comes to the story in the hands of the player for VeilGuard, I guess I'll be frank here. You don't have one. I'll cover the more quote-unquote game-altering choices in the gameplay section, but in terms of dialogue choices to really flesh out your character and present them the way you want them to be and how you want to play this game, you don't get any choice. You can be the good guy who is just the good guy. You can be the good guy who's a bit witty and jokey, or you can be the good guy who is ever so slightly more serious. The option to be the stern, the ends justify the means leader, or a straight out evil bastard are just completely taken from you. And typically, that's how I like my first playthroughs of these types of games. I want to see just how far I can push the extremes and see the outcomes of those actions. It's weird. It's like VeilGuard is actually afraid of creating conflict while also serving up a world-ending plot. At the end of all this, the story of Dragon Age the VeilGuard is gonna get a 7 from me. Literally most of the final 2 missions being what saved it. But saying the last 2 hours of a 22-hour game is the good part just is not enough to justify the rest. This is unrelated and will not affect the final score, but I did some research after completing the game, and I came across something that I feel like I should mention, as at least to me, it explains where all the tension and decision-making the game so desperately needed could have gone. It's all headcanon, so bear with me. Apparently, this entry in the franchise was originally called the Dreadwolf, and while one, that explains a lot about the ending of the game, it also, honestly, I can't help but feel that it should have remained about the Dreadwolf. Imagine this, if you will. Sorry, headcanon, I know, but I can't help it. Solus is the big baddie, and maybe his goal wasn't to destroy the world, but tear down the Veil and re-empower the elves in an effort to make them the most powerful beings on the planet. Already, the goal is smaller, so companion quests that stray far from the main point feel less out of left field, and there's relative time to do them. On top of that, this could open up huge amounts of conflict between team members. Varric is injured trying to talk down Solus in the beginning, and instead of just telling Rook, "You can handle it, kid," maybe he spends the game desperately trying to convince Rook that his old friend Solus can be saved, because at this point, with him being injured, he's no longer at the helm of the group, you are, which would add a bit of immersion. Rook didn't seem to be ready to be a leader, it was kind of thrust upon him, so he was bound to make some questionable or outright bad calls. Meanwhile, Solus is out there wreaking havoc on our companion cities and the citizens of them, really separating those companions who could be convinced that Solus is misguided and doing the right thing the wrong way from those who have just lost too much and only want to see Solus put down. From there, the choices completely fall to you as your group is very split on which the correct response is. That creates an insane amount of tension within the team, and hell, maybe certain companions refuse to work together after a while. And through that, it forces the player to make real choices. You have to choose to trust Varric and attempt to talk Solus out of his rampage, or you have to choose to kill him. You have to attempt to sway opinions of your team either way. You would have to be in conflict with the unconsolable companions who have lost cities and loved ones to Solus's actions, leading to full fights or companions just leaving the team. And you would have to make the final call. Does Solus live or does Solus die? And hell, if you go the route of vengeance for the innocent, maybe Varric steps in and now you're left to fight your mentor, as he's just not able to let the memories of his old friend go. Or you let him live and it sparks the companions who did leave the group to form groups themselves with the sole objective of taking out Solus and you with him, now that you appear to be one of his sympathizers. VeilGuard could have had some truly gut-wrenching decisions, especially with a smaller goal, allowing you to interact and build better relationships with your companions without the glooming notion of, hey, world ending by the way, people, this crap can wait. I think Dragon Age the VeilGuard could have been an amazing game, but the story and lack of real choice kind of betrayed it from the start. Headcanon over, sorry. Okay, time for the big one, and unfortunately, the gameplay is monstrously repetitive. Don't get me wrong, it was fun in the beginning, roughly the first 5 to 7 hours, but after that, it starts to get stale and honestly rather shallow. So, to give credit where credit is due, the combat does look and feel great. Attacks have a feeling of impact, the ability animations look clean and well designed. In all honesty, the game as a whole does look great. I can't deny that. However, the individual levels are extremely linear, so much in fact they don't really feel like areas that should be in an RPG. They more feel like levels you would find in an FPS game. Long stretches of narrow corridors and occasionally a more open area for fighting. And that was something I was hoping wouldn't progress further than the early stages of VeilGuard while it was establishing itself, but unfortunately this maintained as the status quo all the way to the end, which probably would be less of a sticking point if you didn't have to return to the same 4 or 5 areas time after time after time for story quests, companion quests, or even simple conversations. I'm not gonna lie, after a while that really started to become stale, and unfortunately right around the time that was getting a little old, I was really starting to notice the mindless repetition of the combat. It all felt the same pack after pack. A few light attacks, a few heavy attacks to get the ball rolling, then build your bar and dump your abilities to do the real damage. I did try changing up the build time and time again, but somehow nothing really felt different. Sure, I'm doing different things on screen, but it's all really the same. Click, click 1, click, click 2, click, hold, click 3, repeat. I feel like a major misstep for VeilGuard was giving you 2 weapon types. For the warrior, I had a 2-handed and a sword and shield, but for whatever reason, they didn't allow you to assign different abilities to your bar for each weapon. At least then you could have strung some combos together with a weapon switch, and that may have added some spice, but they didn't do it, and I guess more drop kicks. Yeah. On top of that, when it comes to the 2 selected companions, they really did not add much either. Sure, they also get 3 abilities, but in reality, having one apply an effect and the other detonate said effect was the only feasible option for any amount of real damage, which after a while was always my default go-to. I think they were the only 2 abilities I touched on any of the companions. So yeah, Balara apply, Lucanus detonate, and repeat on cooldown ad nauseum for 22 hours. Wow, that got old fast. Now, before I talk about the game-altering decisions you are allotted occasionally throughout the first playthrough, I have a few more things about the gameplay, but I'll make it quicker. For one, I question the decision to add a choice between companions when, once Rook gets Solus's dagger, he can do all the interactions with the environment himself, and that removed any thought or choice of companion going into a level. I just started picking the only 2 I liked. 2, the puzzles, or at least what I assume were meant to be puzzles. If you needed 2 crystals initials for the pedestals, it was a safe bet that one of them was within 2 feet of you and the other was over there behind some boxes. Honestly, a few times I genuinely thought Dragon Age was calling me an idiot. The puzzles were so damn easy. And 3, while all the enemies do occasionally look different, they felt exactly the same time and time again, to the point that I questioned the addition of a dodge mechanic as well, because after the first few hours, I was well aware what they were gonna do, because they all repeat the same basic moveset, and the danger level going into a fight was not existent by the 5-hour mark. Okay, all that out of the way, let's talk about the game-altering choices. On first playthrough, I thought these would greatly affect the course and scenarios the game would present you, forcing you to live with the consequences of your choices. However, I was mildly concerned when I chose to save Lucanus' city over Neve's, and while she greatly disapproved of that choice, never really brought it up again, and she returned 3 missions later. This is kinda what I meant by VeilGuard being scared of conflict. For all intents and purposes, I left Neve's city to burn, and she didn't seem upset or angry in the slightest. The only consequence of that choice was Neve being put into a hardened state, which on paper was supposed to increase her damage and make romancing her significantly harder. In reality, I never felt either of those negatives. Romancing her didn't feel all that different from when I do save her city, and the damage, honestly, maybe that's a bug or something that it doesn't work, but she didn't do any more than usual, at least not to the amount that I could notice. I continued on in that playthrough, kinda brushing it off like, okay, the city is still standing, so maybe it wasn't that big of a decision. The consequences might be a little light because they can rebuild and this could still be salvaged. Then I got to the end. And look, I'm not gonna spoil the ending outright, but through some of my testing, my working theory is that the big decisions you make outside of the final missions do not matter in the slightest. But guess what does? The fucking companion quests. I will not lie, this pissed me off something royal, knowing that there was really no consequences to any of the choices you make in VeilGuard, and it solely depends on if you take your companion quests all the way to the end.
Until those problems are resolved, we will not be prepared to face the gods.
Apparently, this conversation isn't a suggestion to the player, it's 100% literal. I tested this multiple times, doing no companion quests, doing half of each companion story, full most of them, half on others, and the conclusion I came to is the ending you receive is entirely based on them. Not you, the player, and your actions, but your companions. Sorry, this still irks me to no end, because how are stories completely divorced from the world-ending plot affecting said plot whatsoever? So with all that being said, I couldn't in the right mind give the gameplay of VeilGuard any higher than a 20 out of 50. To a degree, I still think that's being generous, but I also don't want to be jaded about the game because yes, it was fun in the beginning while you are learning the game. Unfortunately, once it gets repetitive and you start noticing it, there's no going back. When it comes to the whole concept of variety, there really isn't much. Not having some form of multiplayer or co-op was a bit puzzling, but outside of playing the story over and over, there really isn't much else to do. And as I have had brutally established for me, you can't really change up the scenarios in the game based on your decisions. I mean, I guess you can go back and do Neve's city's defense instead of Lucanus's, but that's about it. 3 out of 10. Why? Literally because there's 3 classes for playthroughs if you want to do multiple, which... Okay, last one. In terms of replayability, there really isn't a ton to say. Yes, there are 3 different classes and 4 races you can choose from if you want, but unfortunately they all manage to feel exactly the same. Yes, they do different things per se, but between Mage, Warrior, and Rogue, the gameplay feels, well, it doesn't really change. It's just more of basics, heavies, and abilities to do the real damage. For the different races you can pick from, to my knowledge, no interactions or conversations change outside of if you're talking to the dwarfs playing a dwarf, they say our gods rather than just my gods. And depending on if you're a crow or a Lord of Fortune or a Grey Warden, your specific faction kind of just gives you a one of us. Anyway, moving on. So in all honesty, though the character creator is great, I won't deny that, your choice of race or class really doesn't change up the game in any meaningful way. And then while there are multiple endings endings, in all honesty, I got 2 of them and don't really have a desire to get a third. All of them are technically a good ending in a manner of speaking, just to varying degrees. And after the second playthrough, where I discovered that my choices really have no weight and is instead entirely dependent on if I decided to grind out all of the companion quests, yeah, there's really not much point for multiple playthroughs in trying to cause different scenarios, because there aren't any, really. I don't know, in my opinion, replayability is gonna get a 3, mainly because I honestly can't say VeilGuard needs even a second playthrough. So, with everything out of the way, let's get on to the score. In total, we are left with a final score of 33 points and a healthy recommendation to wait for VeilGuard to go on sale before you buy it. To be direct, you aren't missing all that much, and at an MSRP of $59.99, I really can't say it's worth it. On the personal side of it, I'm giving it 22 hours of enjoyment, and even then, I think that's monumentally generous, as that's literally how long my first playthrough took, and that boils down to $2.73 per hour of enjoyment. If I've ever overpaid for something before, it is sure as hell this. I don't know. It's not exactly fun when a game disappoints to this level, and in an unexpected consequence, I'm not sure VeilGuard exactly encourages me to go play the previous entries, which, yes, this was my first Dragon Age game, which is a massive fuck up on my part. I kind of assumed they were all different stories in the same world, so they could be picked out of order, which was wrong. God, was that so very wrong. But even still, I don't know if playing Origins, Dragon Age 2, or Inquisition would have helped the score. Hell, from where I'm sitting with some of my friends, it may have actually helped it. One of my friends has just dubbed this VeilGuard, not even a Dragon Age game in the slightest. Interesting to say the least. Well, I'm sure at some point I'll force myself to go back. After all, it is one of BioWare's titans in the terms of their history, so it'd be kind of stinky to not at least give the first 3 games a shot. But for now, no. Just no. Time for something else. Well, that's about it from me. Hopefully with the new structure, the scoring makes a bit more sense, or at least gives some kind of reference to it, and I'm not just pulling numbers and categories out of my ass randomly as I go. So, yeah. What's next? Huh. That looks fun. See ya.